Didn't sleep much last night.
No, not that. These are good workout apparently. I had muscles sore this morning I didn't even know I had.
Really? Which muscles? Geez, that's a good thing you didn't get a full on.
This reminds me of like those late night infomercials that used to sell those machines that shock your abs and stuff.
Oh.
It's like that one.
You had one? You bought one of them?
No, Kimberly.
Oh.
But I tried it once.
You get ripped from it?
No.
Hey you and welcome. My name is Mike and in this video we're going to talk about a fella by the name of Israel Keyes. Israel Keyes, he is not a nice man and he did a lot of unpleasant things. Was not a nice man. It's believed that he killed up to 12 people before he was finally caught. Right. We'll get into it. It's a lot to get into, so let's. On February 1st, 2012, 18-year-old Samantha Koenig was working the late shift at the Common Grounds Espresso coffee stand in Anchorage, Alaska. She had been working there about a month, was a popular worker, and she was well liked by the regulars. At this stage in his career, Israel Keyes was stalking for locations, not people, looking for places to murder easily, and he had settled on the Common Grounds Espresso stand. It was open later than other coffee stands, making it an easier target. Keyes had chosen that night in particular, as he had tickets to take a cruise to Mexico from Louisiana the very next day. At his home, also in Anchorage, in his shed, he placed 2 heaters to keep it warm, and spread a tarp on the floor to deal with any blood. Shortly before 8 p.m, after listening to his traffic scanner, when he heard something big was happening on the other side of Anchorage which would draw the police away, Israel Keyes pulled over his face a ski mask and approached the Common Grounds coffee stand. He planned on robbing the place, but he didn't even know how many people worked there. Unfortunately, it was just Samantha. He walked up and calmly ordered an Americano. Samantha prepared the drink, but when she turned around to hand it to him, Keyes pointed a handgun at her. He told her to turn off the lights, and then climbed through the window and inside the coffee stand. He told her to get on her knees. As he bound her, she said her father was going to be there at any moment to pick her up. He hesitated, but eventually pushed her, gagged, out the door to his car. He put her in the passenger seat and told her he was going to hold her for ransom. He then drove to his house. Israel Keyes was born in 1978 in Richmond, Utah, to parents who were Mormon and was homeschooled. When the family moved to the state of Washington, they began to attend the Ark, a Christian identity church with pretty racist and anti-Semitic views. He later admitted to sexually assaulting a young girl in Oregon, sometime between 1996 and 1998, when he would have been 18 to 20 years old. At 20, he joined the army. He served at Fort Lewis, Fort Hood, and in Egypt. He was known for his heavy drinking, and his love of the insane clown posse. In 2000, he was honorably discharged from the army, and it was during this time he proclaimed he was an atheist. He said his first murder victim was in 2001, while he lived in Nia Bay, Washington, though it is unknown who his first victim was.
I think I told this one time that, it wasn't long when you got out of the military that you killed somebody and it was that sort of feeling that you needed to do something that was hard to resist.
Keyes also claimed to have murdered a couple while he was living in Washington, and alluded to them being buried in a location near a valley. Keyes further claimed he had committed 4 murders in total while living in Washington state, from 2001 to 2007, but gave investigators very little to go on, alluding to 2 separate murders in either 2005 or 2006.
You were a struggle when you hit them and they died, or was it you killed them? I wasn't trying to kill them, I just no action.
In 2007, Israel Keyes moved to Anchorage, Alaska. Here, he established Keyes Construction and began working as a contractor. He seemed like a very normal person, regular Joe, dedicated to his business and a family man to his daughter and girlfriend. A quiet guy who generally kept to himself. But keep to himself, he did not. By that time, Israel Keyes was already a serial killer, bank robber, and everything in between. His hero was Ted Bundy, and they did share a number of similarities. From Anchorage, he would travel to locations in the United States, always wanting to keep the attention away from him, committing murders and other unspeakable acts. Israel Keyes planned murders well in advance and took extraordinary action to avoid detection. He placed murder bags around the country, filled with shovels, guns, and ammunition. Keyes would later admit to kidnapping a woman on the East Coast in April 2009, who he said was taken across state lines and buried in upstate New York. Authorities suspect the victim may have been 49-year-old Deborah Feldman. Also around that time, Keyes robbed a bank in Tupper Lake, New York. In June 2011, Israel Keyes flew from Alaska to Chicago, and then rented a car and drove more than 900 miles to the small town of Essex, Vermont. On the night of June 8th, Keyes broke into the home of Bill and Lorraine Currier, subdued them, took them to another location where he shot Bill and sexually assaulted Lorraine before strangling her. Their disappearance remained a mystery until Israel's confession. However, the location of their bodies, it remains unknown to this day. Israel Keyes never gave law enforcement an exact number of his victims. It's believed to be around 12. But it would be his last victim, Samantha Koenig, that would prove to be his undoing. After taking her, Keyes drove Samantha to the house he shared with his girlfriend and young daughter, and tied her up in a shed next to the house. He managed to do this unnoticed, somehow, by his girlfriend. He told Samantha he would kill her if she screamed, and then he turned on the radio in the shed to cover up any noise she made. He then left, and, after getting information from Samantha, he broke into Samantha's boyfriend's truck and stole her debit card. His plan was to ransom her and then have the ransom paid into her bank account, and he would withdraw from it. He then returned to his house, poured himself a glass of wine, and went back to the shed. He then sexually assaulted her while choking her, till he killed her. After he was finished with her, he wrapped her body in a tarp, and stuffed her in a cabinet in the freezing shed. By then, it was morning, and he woke his daughter for school and called a cab to get to the airport, where he flew to New Orleans, and a cruise he had booked months earlier. After his cruise was over, Israel Keyes drove to Texas, where he robbed and burned a house. He then robbed a branch of the National Bank of Texas. After that, he drove to Houston and flew back to Anchorage. On February 19th, Keyes returned to his home, removed Samantha's body from the cabinet, and had sex with her frozen corpse. A few days later, he applied makeup to Samantha's face to make her appear alive, sewed her eyes open with fishing line, and photographed her with a recent newspaper. He then included the photo with a ransom note to Samantha's family, telling them to deposit $30,000 into Samantha's bank account if they wished to see her alive again. He then texted Samantha's boyfriend from her phone, giving him directions to a dog park, where he left a photo and the demands. A few days later, Israel cut up Samantha's body and dumped her remains in Matanuska Lake near Anchorage. In early March, Keyes flew to Las Vegas, rented a car, and drove to Arizona, where he used Samantha's debit card to withdraw $400. Keyes wore a disguise when he made the transactions, but an ATM security camera recorded an image of the white Ford Focus rental car he was driving. The image did not capture the license plate, but it was clear enough to determine the make and model of the car. 2 days later, on March 9th, Keyes withdrew money from an ATM in Texas, and the FBI alerted Texas law enforcement officials to be on the lookout for a white Ford Focus. On March 13th, a Texas highway patrolman spotted a white Ford Focus parked at a motel. When Keyes left the motel, the officer followed him and noticed the car was traveling 3 miles over the speed limit. Using this as an excuse, the police officer pulled him over and asked Israel for his driver's license. When Israel gave him his Alaskan driver's license, the officer then called for backup. He knew this was the guy. In the car, police found a dye-stained roll of bills from a bank robbery, the mask Keyes wore while withdrawing the money from the ATMs, a gun, and Samantha's debit card. They arrested Israel Keyes, and a few days later, they flew him back to Anchorage. At first, Israel Keyes refused to talk to investigators, but on March 31st, he admitted to abducting Samantha Koenig from the coffee stand. He said he would give authorities more details eventually on the murder of Samantha and his many other crimes, but he would only talk if they could promise to keep the details from the press. He didn't want his daughter to read about everything he had done to Samantha.
I didn't blame you. I told you from the get-go, before I told you where the freaking bodies were left, I told you that I didn't want the locals involved. And the first thing you do is make a big scene, do a big freaking archaeological dig right alongside the main road.
Come on, you agreed in the past, if we're being honest here, that we've handled that situation as quietly as possible. And to whatever extent we could, we shut people's mouths, and the only problem was probably one cop that didn't get the message early on. And that was it. Because
No, I think you need to back up to your recordings. Because I remember the conversation, and I said I didn't want the locals involved in it. And I know now I talked to the guy, I talked to the lead investigator. Not only did you involve him in that, but you took him to New York to dig up the guns. You had him involved from the very.
When the federal prosecutor pressed Keyes on whether or not Samantha was dead or alive, he told him she was dead. He said, "I'll tell you everything you want to know. I'll give it blow by blow if you want. I have lots more stories to tell." He did agree to tell the investigators the details of the abduction and murder of Samantha Koenig, as well as where to find her body. And a few days later, police recovered her remains from Matanuska Lake.
It's not the news family and friends were hoping for. Anchorage police announced today they found a body they believe to be Samantha Koenig's in Matanuska Lake out in the valley. Channel 2's Jason Lamb was there as investigators dove into the frigid waters this evening, and he now joins us live from the Common Grounds coffee stand where Samantha was abducted more than 2 months ago. Jason.
Maria, the place that became so well known as the headquarters in the search for Samantha Koenig has tonight become a makeshift memorial.
He then told them about the many, many murders he had committed. On May 23rd, Keyes appeared before a United States District Judge in a federal court for a hearing to set a trial date. Partway through the hearing, Keyes broke free from his steel leg shackles and jumped over the railing into the first row of seats in the gallery area. Deputies tackled Keyes and used a taser to subdue him.
Right, I mean, even still, from their perspective, come on, let's face it. Yeah, what happened yesterday? Ooh, I'm a bad guy. I tried to escape, but let's be honest. Nobody really thought I was a good guy before that, so. It's not like being escaping suddenly makes me untrustworthy. I was kind of untrustworthy before that, so. I was concerned about the media coverage, not really thinking about the effect it would have on the things we've discussed, thinking more about, that is my bottom line. I didn't want a bunch of press, and didn't want a bunch of drama, and honestly, I could have lived with the drama as long as I had been successful in escaping, but since I didn't, now I'm like, man, I really wish I hadn't created all this drama. Well,
he expressed no remorse whatsoever for any of the crimes he committed.
Where are they at with did they find the bodies yet?
It's a football field and stuff.
They're making progress, but it's just
It could still be like a couple weeks or something.
yeah, it definitely.
They're not going to stop.
This is, tenacious. One of the best analogies I've heard for it is it's more like an archaeological thing. Maybe it's just going through and kind of tossing things
Right.
until you find what you think you're looking for.
It's a lot of trouble. I almost feel guilty. Costing the taxpayers a lot of money. I just kept my mouth shut.
But that's how committed the FBI
No, I
is.
understand.
They, just
Well, it sounds like they've got it. They've got the area. They just got to find it.
Investigators who questioned Keyes said he was arrogant and sometimes seemed bored while relating to details of his crimes. But when talking about an abduction or murder, he'd get excited and sit on the edge of his seat.
Certain aspects of this that, there's no way around it, but, as far as different things that were done with the bodies and the sexual assault stuff, that type of stuff, I don't see, if that has to be part of the hearing, then we gotta figure out something different.
In late November, Keyes met again with investigators, but by the end of the interview, he seemed distracted and told them he might be willing to talk to them the following week. 2 days later, at 5:57 a.m., a prison guard performing a security check noticed a strange red-colored streak on the floor of cell 3. Israel Keyes was found lying face down in his cell, covered in blood. He was pronounced dead at 6:13 a.m. He had slit open his left wrist along the vein, and a razor blade attached to a pencil was found under his body. Wanting to make sure he got an A+ in killing himself, Keyes laid on his stomach and tied a bedsheet noose around his neck. Then, with his left leg bent back, he tied the other end of the sheet around his left ankle. This ensured that when he lost consciousness due to blood loss, the force of his leg lowering back down to the bed would tighten the noose around his neck and strangle him. Police officials still have not determined how Keyes obtained a razor blade while locked in his cell. Israel Keyes died doing what he loved, killing. But now the investigators would never know about his many more victims that he never told them about, or the locations of the bodies that were hidden across the United States. Keyes left a 4-page suicide note on a yellow legal pad, so saturated with his blood it was unreadable until the FBI restored most of it, though it didn't hold much in the way of information regarding his crimes, or anything the police could use.
A man who says he killed 4 people in Washington and 4 others across the country was held today. Israel Keyes' family and their pastor drove to the funeral home from East Texas, but no one else attended. Before he killed himself in his Alaska jail cell, Keyes admitted to investigators he murdered a couple in Vermont last year. He also raped and murdered an Anchorage barista and dismembered her body in February.
Israel Keyes' family stepped out of their van and filed into the funeral home before the service today. His mother, 4 sisters, and their husbands attended. Keyes' 6 other siblings and former Colville neighbors never made it.
I'm sure just the infamy surrounding the whole event would greatly discourage those that would have come.
And so ends the long, tragic, and horrific story of Israel Keyes, psychopath, murderer, and someone who held the key information on a long list of cold cases that will now likely never be solved. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you'd like to see some more of my videos, please subscribe if you wanna. And otherwise, I will see you as always, real soon in the next video. Thank you again so much. Mike out.
They didn't want to be friends with her anymore, which is sick. You know, if you don't want to be friends with somebody, leave them alone, but don't murder them.
What do you want to say to these 2 girls?
Rotten hell. How's that? Because that's exactly what I want them to do. I want them to go through the pain and agony my daughters went through. I want them to have no life because Skylar doesn't have one.
Hey you, and welcome back. My name is Mike, and in this video right here, we're going to look into the case of Skylar Neese. This is going to be a hard one to make my little jokes about, Skylar Neese disappeared from her home in Star City, West Virginia on July 6, 2012. There's a lot of that social media yoke people keep telling me about in this video, and we'll also take a look at her two best friends. It's definitely one of those with friends like these kind of situations. So let's get into what happened to Skylar Neese. Skylar Neese was born on February 10th, 1996, to parents Mary and Dave Neese. Often described as intelligent, compassionate, stubborn, and bubbly, Skylar was an only child. She grew up and went to elementary school in Cheat Lake, West Virginia. When Skylar was in the 2nd grade, she met Shelia Eddy. Shelia, who was 5 months older, was also an only child. The two girls immediately became friends. They began high school together in 2010. At high school, the two met Rachel Shoaf, an aspiring actress and singer.
The world around me changes.
Like Skylar and Shelia, she too was an only child. The three started hanging out together and began to get into just a little bit of trouble, like nothing major. Drinking alcohol, smoking weed, skipping school, breaking curfew, that kind of stuff. Parents and friends of both Skylar and Rachel claimed that Shelia was a bad influence on the two. Some of Skylar's friends actually avoided hanging out with her when she was with Shelia, whom they described as mean and controlling. Rachel's friends said the same thing about Shelia, whom they blamed for changes in Rachel's personality and her behaviour. Regardless, Skylar had no intention of breaking up her relationship with Shelia, a friend she looked up to. Rachel's reasons, however, for staying and hanging out with Shelia were less obvious. She was from a relatively affluent family and was more popular than Shelia. She didn't really need her to be cool. This is just straight out of a high school drama. It's ridiculous. I think Rachel just liked the fact that with Shelia she was able to do things she couldn't do with the friends who shared her similar religious background. She was able to break the rules with Shelia. Anyway, despite, Shelia being constantly described as the bad one, she was evil, that kind of stuff, it was actually Rachel. When she entered the scene, that's when things took a turn. For a while, everything seemed to be going fine until their sophomore year. Skylar then was put in an uncomfortable position when, during a sleepover in late summer 2011, she watched Shelia and Rachel have drunken sex together. The sleepover ended with Skylar and Shelia arguing. A rift had begun to form between Skylar and Shelia. While Shelia and Rachel were becoming closer, Skylar had started to become excluded.
I can't sing when I'm high. You heard me. Oh my God, you know what? I need to tell you a secret. I just forgot. You have a secret from me? Well, I mean, I haven't told anyone. Not even Skylar? No. Okay. I didn't even tell Skylar that I get high. That's one of my secrets too. Like, I didn't tell her that. But anyways, well, I told my mom. That what? I rear-ended someone.
Often, Shelia and Rachel would dress alike, leaving Skylar the odd girl out. Both Shelia and Rachel were sexually active and had boyfriends, while Shelia and Rachel viewed Skylar as kind of an immature little tag-along. But she also knew a lot of things about Shelia and Rachel that no one else knew. She knew their secrets, which will cause a problem. Skylar hinted at this several times on Twitter, at one point tweeting, "I'd tell the whole school all the shit I have on everyone, which is a lot. Hashtag if I could get away with it." As I said, Twitter will come up a lot in this story. Arguments that were often held on Twitter between Skylar and Shelia continued to worsen. A tipping point came when, in early June 2012, Skylar and Shelia spent an entire 1-week trip to Myrtle Beach fighting, and when they got home, Shelia told Rachel that Skylar has to die. Now, Sheila's call for murder didn't come out of the blue. Fellow students and a teacher even had overheard the girls talking about the best ways to dispose of a body in October 2011. Now, the fact was that just a few weeks before they were overheard talking about that, a body had been discovered not far from where they lived, so it wasn't really thought of that odd at the time. But according to one girl who overheard them, they were specifically talking about Skylar. However, when this girl told Skylar, "Hey, I just overheard your two best friends talking about how to dump your body and nobody would find it," Skylar was like, "Oh, they're just playing a game. No biggie. Whatever." Yeah. Even so, she confronted the girls about their conversation, but they assured her it was nothing.
Would you guys rather suffocate or get shot?
Get shot.
Shot.
Wait, depends on where.
Would you rather in the head?
Shot. There would be no suffering at all.
Eaten by ants or suffocated?
Suffocated.
Drowning or suffocating?
Suffocating. It's almost the same thing.
I know, but it's not.
Right
because
in
if
their head.
you were on a pillow.
But that wasn't the only warning sign. In spring 2012, worried that Skylar might blackmail them, Rachel allegedly told another student, "I wouldn't mind if she died." As you do. Rachel also half-jokingly blurted out, "We should kill her," during a science class, followed by Shelia nodding in agreement. Still, the group continued to hang out together, and while Skylar was aware of the state of her friendship with Shelia, still her best friend, she had no idea what was coming. This was her last tweet. On Thursday, July 5th, 2012, Skylar got home from her shift at Wendy's at about 10 p.m. She then kissed her parents goodnight, went up to her room. Around midnight, Shelia and Rachel either called or texted her, asking if she wanted to go for a ride with them. Shelia parked her car next to Denise's apartment, and Skylar, as she usually did, it had become a habit for her, she snuck out of her room, placing a small bench beneath the room's window, and she got into the car with the two other girls. Unbeknownst to Skylar, the trunk of Sheila's car contained a shovel, fresh clothes, towels, and bleach. The three girls then drove to Morse Run Road, a one-lane back road. Shelia parked the car on a spot about a mile into the road, and they got out. They chatted for a while, and when Skylar started walking towards the car to pick up a lighter, the girls counted to 3, and, on this pre-arranged signal, started stabbing Skylar with knives they had kept hidden beneath their hoodies. Skylar tried to run, but she was tackled by Rachel. Skylar managed to grab her knife and fight back, inflicting a cut above Rachel's ankle, but she was overpowered by the two girls, stabbing her repeatedly. The girls then stood over her, watching her die. In her dying moments, she could only say, "Why?" Shelia and Rachel had planned to bury Skylar, but the ground turned out to be too rocky for their shovels. Instead, they moved the body next to a big tree and covered her with rocks and branches. After washing themselves in a creek, the girls disposed of their bloody clothes and knives, but left Skylar's turned-off cell phone next to her body. All of this took a few hours, and the girls were back home by dawn. The next day, Skylar's parents left for work early. They assumed Skylar was still asleep in bed. Her father, Dave, came home around midday so that Skylar could borrow his car for her shift at Wendy's. However, no one was home, and the door to Skylar's room was locked from the inside. Dave then noticed a small bench outside and an open window and realized Skylar had snuck out at some point during the previous night. He immediately called Shelia to find out if she had been in contact with Skylar. She admitted to having talked to Skylar on the phone around midnight, but she hadn't seen her. Soon after, Mary, Skylar's mother, got home, and a manager at Wendy's called asking about Skylar. With the situation becoming more worrying, the Neeses called the police. Then Shelia rang. This time she changed her story, admitting that she and Skylar had in fact gone joyriding the previous night. According to her, they had picked Skylar up around 11 p.m. and returned her home at the end of the street in less than an hour, before midnight. Skylar's mother, Mary, knew something was seriously wrong, and she took to Facebook. Soon after, Shelia and her mother, Tara, arrived at Skylar's home wanting to help in the search for Skylar. They began by knocking on nearby houses. Have you seen her? Is she here? Did you see anything? They got nothing. And then they asked their landlord, who had surveillance video, and they seen the surveillance footage. No one at the time realized that the car Skylar was seen getting into was in fact Sheila's car. Now, no one at this point actually suspected Sheila's story, so they didn't bother to rewind even further to see if Shelia had in fact picked her up at 11 and dropped her home. They didn't bother. They just seen Skylar getting into some stranger's car. It was Sheila's car, but for some reason nobody recognized it as Sheila's car. They even erroneously described it as an SUV when it's not an SUV. It's quite strange. And when the police officer who had arrived viewed this surveillance footage, he said, get this, she voluntarily probably ran away with some guy, and she'll be back in a few days, don't worry about it. Probably the worst advice you could ever give someone, like ever. After Skylar went missing, Shelia definitely played the victim card. Kinda. So then the detective who's assigned to Skylar's disappearance from the local police department and was joined by an FBI agent because another person had gone missing in the area a couple weeks previous and they thought it might be linked. They interviewed Shelia on July 9th, 3 days after the murder. Shelia merely repeated what she had told earlier about picking Skylar up at 11 p.m. and dropping her off less than an hour later. Shelia seemed more curious about the investigation than worried about her missing friend. And it was the police detective who, when interviewing Shelia, noticed she had a silver car and linked that to the one in the surveillance footage. And the next day, the detective called Rachel, and Rachel pretended to know nothing about Skylar's disappearance. She had left for church camp on July 7th, but spent the morning of July 6th boating with her mother and her mother's friend. Both her mother and her mother's friend noticed the cut on Rachel's ankle. It was agreed that Rachel would show up for a face-to-face interview once she got back from the camp, but she never showed. When the detective later got a chance to interview Rachel face-to-face, she told the exact same story as Shelia, that they had dropped Skylar off before midnight. And the detective thought that their stories that they told separately were so precise to such a degree, they seemed rehearsed. Nevertheless, there was nothing really to go on. Skylar was last seen getting voluntarily into a car, so they couldn't issue an Amber Alert. Because they can only issue that for abducted children, but Skylar did this seemingly voluntarily. Skylar's family and her friends thought this was extremely bizarre. Not only was she not the type of person to just leave and not tell anybody, she'd also left her contact lenses, her phone charger back in her room. She left the bench outside her room window. She left the room window open as if she was coming back, you know? The school year then started about a month later, and they were still no closer to finding out anything about Skylar. Mary Neese, understandably, was pretty darn unhappy about this, and she contacted the state police, and they took on the case. Warrants were issued to seize the means of electronic communication from Shelia and Rachel. The state police also reviewed the surveillance tapes several times, before finally figuring out Shelia is never seen picking Skylar up at 11 p.m.
We're going to start with her father, Dave Neese. Thank you, sir, for being here. Our hearts go out to you. We know these past 2 months must have been horrific. Tell us about what your daughter did right before she disappeared. How did she get out of your home, and what did she do, according to you, with her friends?
Well, she came home from work, like you said, that evening, and she got home and walked in the door. She went over to her mother, hugged and kissed her mother, and she came over to me, kissed me, and, went to her bedroom, and that's the last we've seen of her.
Now, Shelia had tried to insert herself into the investigation from the get-go. She kept on trying to get onto the Neese's good side. She would cry and appear upset and completely distraught over Skylar and wherever she was. She would distribute missing posters and everything, appearing to be the biggest victim of all. She began to ask the Neeses about the investigation. And when the police told the Neeses, "Don't tell Shelia about where we are in this investigation. We think, she might know more than she's telling us. We have reason to be suspicious." Shelia then started getting other people to ask about the investigation. She wanted to remain one step ahead at all times. And back at school, rumors about Shelia and Rachel just swirled and swirled. Rumors like maybe Skylar had overdosed and Shelia and Rachel had left her to die. Now, and at this time, Shelia was referring to the FBI and the state police as her best buds, and they were all hunky-dory trying to find Skylar together. Rachel, on the other hand, was starting to crack like an egg. Rachel was just trying to get away from it, wasn't having any of it, didn't even want to know anything, didn't even visit Skylar's parents. She just wanted to shut down almost and not hear anything, close her ears, bury her head. And Rachel really started to fall apart. And the authorities noticed. They helped push Rachel into changing her story after they pointed out the surveillance footage does not match up, and that they had their cell phone records, so they were able to kind of track where they were to a limited degree. So Rachel changed her story. She said that the three of them went out for a ride, and that Skylar just ran off into the woods, and that Shelia and Rachel, they weren't able to find her. And that was her story then. And Shelia then changed her story to match Rachel's story, but only after she heard Rachel had changed her story. On December 16th, and still no idea of what happened to Skylar, Mary posted a long message to her Facebook account. The post detailed the various steps that had been taken so far by the law enforcement and the community in order to find Skylar. Mary also implicitly called Shelia and Rachel out for lying, and even mentioned the possibility that Skylar might have been murdered. And here are some of the many, many tweets that Rachel and Skylar got. The entire community suspected them. Rachel later got in a fight with her parents. She locked herself in a room, she threatened to kill herself, and she had to be hospitalized in a psychiatric unit. On January 3rd, police interviewed Rachel again. And after only a few short questions, Rachel said, "We stabbed her." Rachel told them what had happened, that they had picked Skylar up after midnight, driven her to a remote back road, stabbed her to death and buried her body. When the police asked why she and Shelia had done it, she could only come up with, "We just didn't like her anymore." It was agreed that Rachel would take the police to the location of the body immediately. The investigators, Rachel herself and her attorney, arrived at the location where Rachel said they had killed Skylar. It was so snowy that Rachel couldn't pinpoint the exact spot where they had buried her. The investigators would have to wait for the snow to melt. The investigators now knew what happened to Skylar, but with her body still buried in the snow, they had no evidence beyond Rachel's words. Knowing Shelia would be anxious to meet her buddy, they put Rachel's room under electronic surveillance and had her set up a meeting with Shelia. Unfortunately, Rachel wasn't able to extract anything incriminating out of Shelia on that occasion. 2 weeks later, on January 16th, the investigators returned to the spot, this time with a canine unit. The snow had mostly melted. While the dog's handler was picking up a GPS tracker that had fallen off the dog, he noticed skeletal remains under a pile of branches. 6 months after Skylar had disappeared, she was finally found. During the following months, Rachel was allowed to roam free while the investigators were gathering evidence, not only against her, but particularly against Shelia, who they thought would never admit to the crime. And Shelia knew they were after her. Shelia was then given a search warrant to seize every knife in her house and also her car. She also knew by this time that Skylar's body had been found. On March 13th, the body had been verified as being Skylar Neese's, and this information was released to the public. Skylar's post-mortem revealed she had been stabbed 50 times. Still, nothing else really about the circumstances of her death were announced. And Shelia tweeted this on that day. About a month later, Shelia then tweeted this. On May 1st, Rachel surrendered herself to the authorities and she had her first day in court where she pled guilty to the murder of Skylar Neese. She agreed to testify against Shelia in any trial. In exchange, the prosecution agreed to recommend 20 years for second-degree murder. Shelia was then arrested at Cracker Barrel while dining with her mother. On September 4th, Shelia pled not guilty to the charges of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. Then, at Sheila's pre-trial hearing on January 24th, 2014, Shelia started sobbing as soon as she sat down, before the trial had even begun. Often she'd cling to her attorney for support. She then changed her plea and pled guilty to first-degree murder. In exchange for her guilty plea, the prosecution agreed to a sentence of 15 years to life, with the possibility of parole after 15 years.
Shelia Eddy, how do you plead to the offense of murder in the first degree of the felony charged in count 3 of the indictment in this case?
Guilty.
The record will reflect that the defendant has entered a plea of guilty to the offense of murder in the first degree of the felony charged in count 3 of the indictment in this case. You may be seated. Watch the chair, please. Ms. Eddy, have you heard what the prosecutor said the state's evidence would be?
Yes, sir.
Is that substantially correct?
Yes, sir.
Is that what happened?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Eddy, are you entering a plea of guilty to the offense of murder in the first degree, the felony charged in count 3 of this indictment, because you are in fact guilty of this offense?
Yes, sir.
My name is David Neese. I'm Skylar's father. I'm here today with my wife, Mary. The person sitting before you, Skylar's so-called friend, took her away from us without any remorse or feelings. You can look into the eyes of those who are responsible, but you can never hear what they heard as they were taking her life. You can see the faces of the killer, but you can't see Skylar's face. You can never understand the fear that she must have had as they took a knife and ended her life.
Ms. Eddy, would you please stand? Shelia Eddy, for your conviction of the offense of murder in the first degree upon your plea of guilty, it is the sentence of the court that you've been imprisoned in the West Virginia State Penitentiary for the rest of your natural life. Consistent with the requirements of the Constitution of the United States, that sentence is technically with mercy, which makes you eligible for parole after you have served 15 years.
After the trial, Dave Neese, Skylar's father, swore that he'd be at every parole hearing to make sure Shelia never walks free.
Dave, I also have a question for you. I know nothing will ever replace losing your daughter, but does this bring any sort of sense of closure, and can your family start to move on?
Like I said before, there's no closure at all, I don't think. I mean, who knows how my mom works right now, but if you can figure out, let me know. But the only way that there could be closure if they both were in prison. I know they're both in jail right now. One of them's been sentenced, one of them hasn't. After the other one gets sentenced, then we can start worrying about all that. But right now, I don't think it'll ever be closed. My little girl was something you can't close.
Rachel's sentencing hearing began on February 2nd. She accepted the sentence, 30 years, for second-degree murder, with the possibility of parole after 10.
And still to this day, we do not know why they did this. And that is a question we would like an answer to. Because what in the world would be so bad that you would have to kill Skylar and to put her through what you did? You didn't think about that when you were doing it, so why would we need to think about how you feel now? You stood there for over a year, comforting, being with us, telling us you knew nothing. When the police and everybody was coming close, then you decided to confess. You need to think about everything you put us, your family, and everyone else through with not being able to have the pleasures that other kids could have. No grandchildren, no marriages, no prom, no graduation. How do you think that would make us feel?
Both are currently serving their sentences at Lacken Correctional Center. In 2014, Skylar's parents sued the girls and their mothers for damages over Skylar's death. They were arguing that the parents, by neglecting to supervise their daughters, are partially responsible for what happened to Skylar. Now that doesn't really seem right. I mean, Shelia and Rachel's parents are no more responsible for what happened to Skylar than Skylar's parents are for not watching her enough, and therefore she was able to escape out her room the night she died. Now that case never went to court, as Skylar's parents accepted an offer from their legal teams. They settled for $5 million. However, it's unlikely they will ever see that money. One of the most disturbing things about this case is how there was seemingly no motive other than they didn't like her anymore, which is just terrifying and extremely disturbing. It is an extremely sad and tragic case of what happened to Skylar Neese, a case of teenage jealousy, anger, resentment. I don't know. But it is straight out of like a high school drama. I'm pretty sure there's actually a movie or TV shows of high school things that are based on this. And that's the story of Skylar Neese. Pretty disturbing. Let me know what you think about it down below. And finally,